In this video, I'll show you step by step how to make this pendant using just a few pieces of copper. I will also have links to all the tools and materials I used in this video in the description. And to start things off, I need a stone to build from. I'll be using this oval amethyst cabochon, but you're going to be able to use pretty much whatever shape you like, as long as the back of it is flat. And the next thing you're going to need is a backing plate that this stone will fit onto. You could pretty much use whatever thickness you like for this, but I try to use 0.6 millimeters at the absolute thinnest. And this is pretty much the right size for what I need. Also keep in mind that we're going to be soldering this. And if you have too much metal, it's going to be a lot harder to heat up, which would make it harder for the solder to flow properly. When it comes to the bezel material that's going to be setting the stone, it's going to be much thinner. Something around 0.2 to 0.3 millimeters will work perfectly. And the last thing I'm going to need is a short piece of wire about 7 to 8 inches long and about 1.6 millimeters thick. With all that information, I like to draw out a simple design, and these little booklets come in really handy for doing that. This way I can easily look up the sizes, along with visualizing what it's going to look like. It's also nice that I can just trace out the stone onto here and draw from there. And if you're not familiar with bezel setting, let me explain it real quick. Here's a cross section of our piece. You can see where the stone and the bezels would be, and the bezels basically need to come up just enough to go over the curving part of the stone so it has something to hold on to and keep it in place. There's a bit of a balance you want to achieve with this. You don't want it too short where it's not going to hold, or too tall where it's going to cover up too much of the stone. If we take a look at the stone itself, you can see that it's not too far up where it actually starts to curve in, and using some calipers I can measure it out, and about 2 millimeters should work fine. And you can use the calipers to scratch this into the metal so you have a mark to cut on. That being said, this is frowned upon by a lot of people, so you can also use some dividers to do the same thing. And these are fully adjustable, as you can see, and you could just kind of mark it out on the stone and lock it in place. And when it comes to actually marking the metal itself, you can use the dividers and kind of hook it onto one side that's flat and slide it down the metal. But now that I have a clean line to cut on, I need to actually cut it. And normally I would use a jeweler's saw to cut this, but it's a bit too thin, so I'm going to use some metal shears. And these come in really handy for thin metals, but they can also cut metals up to about 0.5 millimeter thick with no problem. And I'm trying to cut this as straight as possible, but if I do get a little off, it should be fine. And you might notice that the part that I'm cutting off is curling up on itself. And this is normal for cutting thin materials in this way, and I'm going to have to heat it up either way to soften the metal anyways, so it doesn't really matter. This is my annealing and soldering setup, and I keep it on a tripod so I don't risk burning my workbench. And I'm just going to put this on the charcoal block, and to heat it up I'm going to be using a butane torch. I'm just trying to get this up to a dull glow over the entire piece, so I will have to flip it over to get to the other side of it, so I don't risk melting the top. And you might have noticed that my metal is starting to oxidize, and I'm going to need to clean that off. To do that, I'm going to be using a crock pot and heating up a mild acid, also known as a pickling solution. And this is the dry powder that I use that you just add to water. It's also usable for a very long time and you don't have to remake it. But anyways, I'm going to drop my piece into there and wait about 10 minutes. And when using this acid, make sure you're not using any type of steel tools with it, like the tongs that you would use to get your parts out. Make sure it's made out of copper, otherwise the steel will cause a chemical reaction. And before doing anything else with the part, make sure it's rinsed off in some clean water. And then I can unroll this and wipe it off, because it will have some loose copper particles on it, and I'm just doing this with a small piece of paper towel. There we go, this is all cleaned up and ready to use now, but now I need to get this to the right shape and size to actually fit on our stone, because I just cut out a length of material that was longer than what I was going to need. And there's more than one way to do this. One of them is cutting some tape down to around the same size of what your bezel is going to be, and wrapping that around your stone. This is still not a perfect method, but it'll get you close enough, and we'll be able to fine tune the rest. And once you get the tape wrapped all the way around and overlapping, you can cut it with a razor blade. Be careful if you're using a softer stone, because a razor blade can scratch or damage your stone. Once it's cut, you can dispose of the excess and remove the tape from the stone. And we can stick that piece of tape to our bezel wire now, and it'll give us a pretty good idea of how much of it we actually need. But I'm not going to be marking directly on the end of the tape. I'm going to go about 1 millimeter longer. And using my metal shears, I'll cut right on that marking and take the tape off and put it to the side just in case I needed to get in later. With that done, I can now fit this to my stone and make sure it's going to be a perfect fit. You can see as I'm putting the bezel around the stone, it's starting to take shape, and with it completely around the stone, I want it as tight as possible so I can see exactly where it overlaps, so I can mark it and do the last bit of cleanup on this. I need this bezel to be as flat as possible on both ends, that way when I'm soldering it, everything will go together properly. And the easiest way to achieve that is using a miter block like this. It allows me to clamp the bezel wire in place, and it gives me a flat surface to file on and stop me from going too far. And with this material being as thin as it is, it doesn't take much to get it filed completely down. And to get it into to this tool, I did have to straighten out the material again, so once I get it flattened out, I'll reshape it around my stone and line up the two ends, and it should match up kind of like this. Also, don't worry if they're not the same size, just make sure that the bottom part of them match up and we should be fine, and we'll fix this slight problem later. But now we can start doing some soldering, and we're going to have to use something called Flux. This will stop the metal from oxidizing, and will keep our soldering area clean and our solder will be able to flow properly. I'm also going to be using silver solder for this, and starting with the hard silver solder, which has the highest melting point. The solder chips that I'm using are 1mm squares, and tweezers are pretty much a must when working with them. I'm just going to put one piece on my charcoal block, and then place the bezel directly on top of it right where the seam is. I wanted to make sure you could see that before I put flux on everything. And I just need to cover the area where I'm going to be soldering. And with that all set up, I'm going to use my same butane torch, and slowly heat this up. And making sure to go around this in circles, evenly heating it up. And then focusing the flame on the solder joint area so the solder can flow. And you should see it climb up the bezel and fill in that gap. And now I can take this and put it into my pickling solution to clean it all off. And here it is after a few minutes. And it doesn't look like it has any gaps in the solder joint, so we can move on from here. And you might notice that it's no longer the right shape anymore, which is normal. And I can easily get it back to the right shape by putting it on the stone. This is also a great way to see if it actually fits, or if it came out too big or too small. And as you can see, it fits the stone perfectly. And once fitted like this, it should be back in the shape that it needs to be, so I can just pop the stone out carefully. And now I need to get this attached to the backing plate. Just make sure the flattest part of your bezel is sitting on the backing plate, or it's not going to solder properly and you're going to have gaps. When it comes to the soldering part, I'm going to be using this thick steel mesh. That way I can heat the entire backing plate from underneath and then move on top to make all the solder flow. I'm going to have to use a lot more flux for this, and I'll be covering the entire backing plate, and then place my bezel on top of that while everything's still wet. And then with my torch, I'm going to just quickly heat everything until it dries out. This will hold everything in place, so I can place all of my solder pieces, and with everything already pre-dried, my solder won't be jumping around when everything is boiling off. And when it comes to solder, I already used the one with the highest melting temperature, so I'm going to go down to medium, which will melt a little bit sooner, and that means that the solder on the bezel that we already did won't melt. And just like before, I'm using tweezers to pick up the pieces of solder, and I'm placing them on the inside edge of the bezel. That way when the solder does flow, it will go directly underneath the bezel and permanently attach it to the backing plate. Also, if you're wondering why I'm using copper in this video, it's mostly due to the cost of the material, and if you're just starting out, it should be pretty affordable to you, and it's overall just a good material to learn on. All the techniques and skills you'll see in this video can be applied to gold and silver as well. With that said, copper is also one of the harder materials to work with, mostly because it oxidizes extremely fast, and it can be a little harder to heat up. So practicing and mastering your skills on copper will make silver much easier. But anyways, with all of our solder placed, it's time to heat it up, and I'm going to use the torch on the underside of this first, and once I see everything starting to turn black on top, I'm going to switch over to the top, and it should make all of our solder flow. Just make sure that you're always moving your torch and not staying in one spot for too long, because the last thing we want to do right now is melt the bezel. And there we go, it looks like most of the solder flowed all the way around. There is one spot where one of these solder pieces moved, and it's not connected. So I'm going to put this in the pickle pot and get it all cleaned off so I can look for any other gaps, and then show you how to fix this. Here it is freshly out of the pickling solution, and you can see where the solder actually flowed, and it almost made it all the way around, but I'm also kind of happy it didn't. That way I can show you how to fix this common problem. And this gap is pretty easy to see, but if you're unsure or just want to check things, you can always use a flashlight or hold it up to the light and see if you can see anything. There shouldn't be any gaps whatsoever all the way around this, and it's usually a pretty easy fix. Just make sure the whole thing is clean in the pickling solution first, then reflux the entire piece, or at the very least where the gap is, and dry out the flux like last time, and then you can place another piece of solder here. And with it being hot still, I could dip my solder in some flux and put it in place, and it'll instantly dry and stick in place. And just like before, I'm going to heat it up from the bottom first, and then move the torch on top directly onto where my solder is, and it should flow properly. And there we go, that problem's all fixed. Now back into the pickling solution again to get this cleaned up, and with that all cleaned up, everything looks good now. And you might notice that the bezel is not even on top, which we'll take care of in a little bit. But first we need to make sure our stone's actually going to fit in this. And before you put your stone directly into this, make sure that you put something behind it, like a piece of string or some dental floss. That way you have something to pull on to get it out in case it gets stuck. And you can see with my bezel and stone setup, it's pretty tight, but it obviously fits and I can move on from here. And be careful when removing your stone, make sure not to drop it, because depending on where it falls, you can crack the stone. Now it's time to cut out the backing plate, and I'm just doing some rough marking around it, so I have somewhat of a ledge around the outside of it. And I'm going to be sawing this out using my jeweler's saw, and I know a lot of people have a hard time cutting clean lines with a saw, especially when you first use use it. So I'm going to purposely cut it out kind of messy and show you how to clean it up so you don't have to worry too much about sawing it out perfectly. And speaking of the saw, I'll be using this one along with a 2/0 blade, and make sure you're using some sort of lubricant for the blade. This will make it saw a lot smoother and not shatter or get stuck. And as you're sawing this out, make sure that you don't accidentally bend your bezel down. And there we go, it's all cut out, and as you can see, it is not even whatsoever. So let's fix that with a hand file. This will make pretty quick work of this and shape everything exactly how I want it to be. It also removes all the sawing marks. And after all that filing, it looks a lot cleaner and more uniform. Now I need to take care of the uneven bezel part of this real quick. And you can technically use a file to do this, but if it gets caught whatsoever, it's going to fold down your bezel and ruin everything. So I highly suggest using some sandpaper. I did tape this down to my workbench because I need a flat surface to do this on, and I'm going to add a little bit of water on top of it. This will help prevent clogging up the sandpaper and keep all the metal filings on the sandpaper. Sanding this down is pretty straightforward. Just apply very light pressure to it and move it around. If you just want to do the same motion over and over again like I'm doing, make sure that you're turning the piece as you go, or move in a figure 8 pattern. This will make sure that everything's even and you don't get any low spots or a weird angle to your bezel. Make sure to check it every so often, but after a few minutes you should have everything nice and flat like this. Because we're using copper, you can see all the silver solder on this, and I want to clean it up just a little bit on the bezel, and if you're making one of these out of silver, it should just blend in, but you still would have to smooth it out. I'm going to be using a rotary tool to do this, and as you can see, there's a lot of different options that you can choose from, and I'm going to be using this small polishing wheel. These all come in different grits, just like sandpaper does, and it's usable on my quick change handpiece. But if you don't have a rotary tool like this one, you can always use a Dremel or something similar. This should come off pretty quickly, and the reason why I'm doing this now is because this is a more aggressive grit, and if I do it after setting the stone, and this accidentally touches the stone, it will scratch it. I'm also going to quickly sand down the inside of the bezel, just to make sure everything's nice and flat, seeing that I have some solder in here that could technically push up the stone. And here it is after going over the entire thing, which was overkill, and you don't need to do this much, just clean up the areas that need to be cleaned up, because as soon as we start soldering this again, it's going to ruin this finish. As you know, we're going to be making this into a pendant, but at this point you could technically turn this into a bracelet or a ring. But for our pendant, we're going to have to add a loop right here, and this is when we need that copper wire. So I can make a few jump rings from it and modify them. There's definitely an overabundance of tools that you can use to make jump rings, and if you have the different types of pliers that can do this, they come in really handy and make quick work of it. But if you don't, you can always use a drill bit set because it's just different sized round bits that we can wrap our metal around. And after eyeballing a few of them, it looks like a 5mm one is going to be best. But before I can make any of the jump rings, I need to anneal the wire and make it soft, and this could be done really quick using your torch. Just make sure after annealing it to clean it off in your pickling solution. After that, I'm going to wrap the wire around the smooth part of the drill bit, and depending on the metal you're using and how thick it is, you might need to use some pliers to hold it in place so you can get a nice tight wrapping on here. And I'm not going to need that many of these, but it's always better to make more than you actually need in case you make a mistake or you drop it and it disappears. Once I have my spiral, I need to cut off the two ends just to make it a little easier to work with. Unfortunately, the metal shears that I used earlier don't really work on this, but flush cutters work really well on wire, and overall a very inexpensive tool. And to cut these into actual jump rings, I'm going to use my jeweler's saw. Make sure you use a lot of lubricant on this, and you can even apply it directly to the coil. It's also a good idea to use some sort of finger protectors. I have these silicone ones, and the only real reason I'm using these is because the metal likes to get kind of hot when sawing through this. And speaking of sawing through this, make sure you have a good grip on it and hold it kind of near the edge of the bench pin and just start sawing away on one side. Try to go as straight as possible, and the more pieces you cut through, the harder it's going to be to hold, so make sure to readjust if needed. You can also angle your saw frame in a way that you're cutting through one of them at a time instead of all of them. And with all the jump rings cut out, they're going to look something like this, and I'm going to need to close at least 2 of them. And you can do that really quick with some pliers. Now that I have 2 of these jump rings, I can use one of them to support my piece while I put the other one where I want it to be, and mark out 2 spots where I want to cut it so it fits with the piece better. And now that I have it marked out, I can cut those 2 pieces off with my jeweler's saw. And there we go, I have my new part, and it lines up with the curvature of the main piece. That being said, this jump ring is much thicker than the back plate, and I think it would look unfinished if I had just soldered it on like this. So I'm going to add a ramp to it, but it'd be very difficult to hold this with my fingers to do that, so I'm going to use a ring clamp. And if you've never seen one of these before, you can see that it's a very simple tool. It's basically just 2 pieces of wood that clamp together to hold whatever you're putting inside of it, and a wedge holds it together. And now I can take my file, put it at an angle, and add that slope. And I will stop every so often and check it against the backing plate to make sure that they're around the same size. And once I got it down to my liking, this is what it looks like. Now I just need to solder this on. Just like before, I'm going to flux the area and preheat it to dry out the flux. And using some tweezers, I'll place my 2 pieces of solder. And I dipped both of these in flux beforehand, just so I can have the best odds at them performing properly. When it comes to the heating up process, I'm going to start on the bigger piece and get that up to temp before heating up the smaller piece. That's mostly because solder likes to jump to whatever is hottest, and I want them to be around the same temperature so it just melts and connects them. But as you can see, that worked and everything is now connected. And of course, just like every time we heat something up, it needs to go into the pickling solution to get cleaned off. And here it is all cleaned up. It looks like it attached with no problems. There is a little bit of extra solder that I do need to clean up, which I'll be able to do just like I showed on the bezel before. And there we go, that's cleaned up good enough for now, and looks pretty good, but there is one thing that you need to keep in mind when soldering stuff on like this, is if it's going to be centered or not. You can use a center finder like the one that I make, and you could definitely use this after the fact to check, or you could use it beforehand to mark things out. But it looks like I was able to get it pretty centered just by eyeballing it. But it is time to do the last bit of soldering that we need to do, because this still needs a bail added to it, and we can use that second jump ring that we made, but I do have another option for a bail that looks a lot better in my opinion, and it can be made from the scrap metal from the backing plate. And either way you decide to go, it's only one solder point. But first let me show you how to get the jump ring onto this, just in case you've never dealt with one in the past. Just take 2 sets of pliers and pry it in opposite directions like this. Just don't overdo it, you only need to open it just enough to fit on the piece. But once you have it to that point, you can thread it through, and with both your pliers again, close it. And there we go, we can see how it's going to look with a jump ring, and really it's not that bad and it's completely usable. I just think it looks a lot better with this bail on it. And once it's made, it goes on pretty much the same way. You can just open it up with some pliers and close it with pliers. With that being said, I am completely biased to these, seeing that I'm the one that made the template for them. So let me show you how to make one of these real quick from the scrap from our backing plate. Using my metal shears, I'm going to cut this a little bit smaller, and using my bail template, I'm going to trace it out using my scribe, but you can also use a fine tip Sharpie. From here, you could technically cut this out with the metal shears, but I prefer using the jeweler saw. No matter which way you cut it, you're going to want to clean it up with the file, just to make sure everything is nice and straight and there's no sharp bits. And shaping this into the right shape is really easy if you have these pliers, but if you don't, you can always use a drill bit. And this one is 4mm, but you could probably use something a little bit smaller. And seeing that this metal's already been annealed or softened, you should be able to bend it with just your fingers, at least to start it out. And you should be able to get it to look something like this. You just want to make sure that everything is symmetrical. And you can close it up and finish it with some pliers. Just make sure the 2 ends are touching at the points, mostly because they don't line up perfectly the first time, and they'll be misaligned. And it should look something like this once you're all done. But obviously we can't use it as it is because I closed it. So I'm going to pry it open just enough so I can put it onto my piece. And you can see I already have one on here. I'm just showing you how this is done, seeing that I skipped over it. But anyways, once you have it through like this, you can reclose these, and they'll be ready for soldering. I'm going to be using some reverse grip tweezers attached to this third hand setup, so I can keep everything in place and make sure it doesn't move. And I'm going to try to keep the point where I'm going to be soldering as far away from the main piece as possible. This way I don't really risk melting anything else, or having the solder flow in the wrong spot and stick everything together. Like always, flux the area that we're going to be soldering and dry it out. And with it still hot, I'm going to put my piece of solder on here that has a little bit of flux on it as well. That should instantly dry off and stick it in place. And after that, all I need to do is heat the piece up until the solder flows and connects both pieces together. And there we go, all the soldering work is done for this now, and I can finally move on to actually setting the stone. And in my opinion, bezel setting is probably one of the easiest stone settings you can do, and you definitely have a lot of options when it comes to tools for this. These are some of the ones that I like to use. And you can see that they come in all shapes and sizes. But one common thing is it's normally a material that is harder than whatever you're working with and smooth. There's also hard plastic options that are non-marring, and if you can't get your hands on anything else, a wooden dowel can get you about 95% of the way there. And don't forget to take out whatever thread or dental floss you have behind the stone before setting it. This is also your last chance to polish up the inside of this. This will only really matter if you have a stone you can see through. Depending on the size of the piece that you're working on, you might have a hard time holding it, and that's where this thermoplastic can come in really handy, but it can be done without these. You just put some of these into some boiling water, they'll become pliable, and you can shape them into whatever you'd like. And I let this cool down completely, so now I can quickly heat up the top with my torch, and then I can place the piece into it. Just be careful that you didn't get things too hot and burn yourself. And let this cool down completely so everything hardens in place. But it's definitely nice to have a lot more to hold on to than just the piece itself. And I'm going to be using the brass bezel tool. And I just need to line this up with the top of the bezel and kind of push in. And I'm going to do this in 4 spots right across from one another, kind of in an X or cross pattern. This will lock the stone in place and allow us to go completely around it. And the round shape of this bezel pusher allows me to roll everything up and over without much effort. With those 4 points done, you can see that this stone is now locked in place. And now I can get rest of the bezel down. And I basically just work one side and then the other and just go around the whole thing slowly, pushing the bezel to the stone. And take your time with this, and it's not going to look perfect. There will be some slight gaps and bumps, and it won't be laying down 100% flat, but that will be taken care of in the second step of this. But the more you work your way around it, the more it'll smooth out. And the next step in the process will clean pretty much all of it up. So after a while, it should look a little like this, which it looks okay, but it's not as clean as it can be, and the top of this needs a lot more work. I'm going to switch over to a steel tool and use this to rub against the bezel. This will smooth everything over and give you a nice shiny finish. And the bezel should be pretty soft, seeing that we've heated this piece multiple times, so it should form to the stone pretty well. And after a few minutes of going around the stone, everything looks nice and uniform, and once you think you're done with this, try to move the stone around. And it shouldn't move whatsoever. If it does, you're going to have to go back around it and push a little bit harder most likely to seal it in place. But mine's not moving at all, so it's time to take it off of this piece of plastic. But I don't suggest using the torch to get this off because it can get too hot and damage your stone. So you could dunk this into some hot water, something that's just under boiling, or use a heat gun on low. And you'll know when the plastic is ready because it'll start to turn a little translucent, and you should be able to pull it right off. And there might be some plastic stuck to the piece that you can easily take off after the fact. And with that all done and cleaned up, here's my pendant. And this is the point where you can actually finish it off and change its look completely. And of course, there's a lot of options. You can go with a high polish, you can go with a dull look, a brush look. I'm going to clean it up and add a patina to it, and do a little bit of polishing, but not removing all of the patina. And to add the patina, I'm going to be using something called liver of sulfur, that I mixed into some hot water. And I'm going to submerge this in it for about 10 minutes. And this isn't going to do anything to the stone that I'm using, but if you're using a porous stone like opal, it can damage it or make it cloudy. And as you can see, it turned all the copper black. This also works on silver. Just make sure to rinse this off in some clean water after taking it out. After drying it off, it'll have almost a chalky looking black to it, and parts of it will rub off on your hands. But it can be polished up and give a unique look. And just like everything, there's some options when it comes to polishing and buffing, like this bench polishing motor, or you can get polishing buffs for your rotary tool. And both of these are used with a polishing compound, and you can get these in different cuts or grits. This stuff is also very messy and gets everywhere, so make sure you have some breathing and eye protection. But if you don't want to deal with all that, there's also polishing pads. It's basically a cloth that has polishing compound in it, and you can see the used parts of it turn black. And you don't need to use any type of tool to use it, you just rub it on the piece. And you can see it does a decent job, but it's not going to give you a full high polish. But I do like that it doesn't take too much off, and it even makes some of the black patina shiny. And this is pretty much how I'm going to finish this piece, with a nice weathered look. But most of the time I use other polishing setups. Just be careful when you are using one, because it can grab your piece and throw it across the room, which happened to me when I was trying out different looks. And the ground in my workshop is concrete, so it cracked my stone. And you can see that crack right here. And unfortunately, there's no real way of fixing this. So definitely learn from my mistake. Even with this damage, the stone is completely locked in place still with no movement. I'm still going to clean it up using some hot soapy water and a toothbrush. This will get all the polishing compound off of it. And with it all cleaned up and a chain on it, it is all done. And overall, besides the dropping it and cracking the stone problem, it looks like it came out pretty good. And this is one of the most basic designs I could think of making that would teach you how to make every part of a pendant and be able to set a stone into it. So there's definitely a lot more options that can be done with this that would make it unique or more detailed. And I'll definitely be making a video on that in the future. And if you've made it this far into the video, I want to say thank you for watching, and I hope you found all that information to be helpful. I would like to ask you to do me a small favor, and just leave a comment on this video. And it really doesn't matter what it is, but if you do have an actual question, feel free to leave that as well, and I'll try to answer as many as I can. And if you're interested in any of the tools on my website, use code Bezel at checkout, and save 15% off your order. Well, that's pretty much it, and if you're looking for more helpful jewelry making videos, check out more of my stuff on my channel, and I'll put something up on the screen now that you might find interesting. Other than that, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.